Hello all, and welcome to this seminar on nativism and liberalism, organized by the Loughborough University Nationalism Network. My name is Joanna, and I will be chairing today's talk. For today's talk, we are delighted to have with us Professor Jan Willem Duyvendak. Jan Willem Duyvendak is a distinguished research professor of sociology at the University of Amsterdam. And since 2018, he's also director of the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Study in the Humanities and Social Sciences at the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences. In 2021, he was elected member of the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences, and in 2022 of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. His main fields of research currently are belonging, urban sociology, feeling at home, and nativism. And today he will present his co-authored new book, The Return of the Native, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2023. His book explores the extraordinary rise of nativism in liberal settings, paying particular attention to nativist narratives that intertwine Islamophobia, racism, populism, and nostalgia. In this presentation, he will discuss the rise of nativism in France, the US, and the Netherlands, focusing on striking similarities and small differences. For your information, Professor Duyvendak's talk will take around 30 to 40 minutes, and after that there will be time for you to ask questions. Please note that this seminar will be recorded, so it would be great if you could mute yourself and switch off your camera, unless you're talking or asking a question. And now, without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Professor Duyvendak.
Thanks so much. Thanks for the very kind introduction, and thanks for the invitation to speak. What I will do indeed is that I will try to present the book, which is actually quite ambitious. A book that I co-authored with Josip Kesic and also Timothy Stacy, helped with the book. He started as an editor and actually became more and more an author of the book. And I mentioned Tim with intention because Tim has a background in the UK, and thanks to him, there are some comparative elements regarding the situation in Western Europe, continental Europe, and the UK, even though, as already has been said, most of our comparative work is between the Netherlands and France and the US. Today I will mostly speak about the Netherlands, or at least the empirical part is mostly about the Netherlands, the Dutch case, somewhat comparative with France, and if time permits, I can also elaborate on differences and similarities with the US and the rise of the return of nativism there. All three countries, France, the Netherlands, and the US, are, in my perspective, improbable cases. I will explain why for the return of the native. But even in those countries, those liberal countries, we clearly see a return of nativism, as we see that in the UK. But I have to admit that I'm not a specialist in UK politics at all. So I'm very curious to hear whether you think that the things we are describing also pertain to what's happening in the UK. Let me start. I don't like definition discussions too much, but nonetheless, let's be clear about what we are talking about. So what is nativism? Inspired by the American historian John Hayem, we define nativism as an opposition to an internal minority that is seen as a threat on the grounds of its foreignness. It's important to note that this is building on Hayem's work. Actually, the definition is not exactly the same. Hayem speaks about grounds of people being foreigner. So that's really about people being foreigner, whereas we broaden the definition of natives, and I will explain later why, that it is based on people who think that others are a threat on the grounds of their foreignness. The main opposition here is between foreignness and nativeness. Foreignness refers to people, practices, or ideas deemed to come from elsewhere. It refers to people who are here but not from here, to those who are in the place but perceived as out of place, foreigners, aliens, strangers. Nativeness refers to people, practices, and ideas who primordially belong to the soil, those who are of the place, indigenous and autochthonous, not foreign. And what turns nativeness into nativism, and this is the other central element that constitutes nativism, is the perception that foreign forces pose a threat to the native population. And to be very clear, this is not a normative definition. It is a descriptive definition, an analytical tool, I hope at least. And it is not necessarily just about nativism these days as it manifests itself at the radical right of the political spectrum. Also, the anti-colonial struggle and the struggle of indigenous people fit into this definition, right? Because it is then that they feel threatened by an internal minority coming to their country, an internal minority that is threatening the native population, right? So in that sense, it is a non-normative description, an analytical tool, I hope, that is applicable in many contexts, even though we focus on the return of nativism mostly among the radical right in Western countries. But clearly, nativism is on the rise in many parts of the world. In the book, we don't deal that much with the situation in Russia or India or Latin America. We mostly focus on Western countries and that type of nativism. And I will, as already been announced, I will deal with several types of nativism in Western countries. And I will start with religious nativism. I'm not sure whether you know who's the guy on the picture, and that is Geert Wilders. He's the leader of the most important radical right nativist party, and he's even since the last elections, the leader of the biggest party in the Netherlands. And he is important in the discussion about religious nativism. The most prevalent flavor of nativism is religious nativism, which portrays Islam and Muslims as a threat, since they allegedly fundamentally differ from national and Western European cultures. At the center of these cultural antagonisms, at least in the Netherlands, are gender equality and sexual freedoms, in particularly tolerance for homosexuality. The Islam is reduced to its most radical version and depicted in terms of oppression and backwardness, whilst Dutchness is seen as the embodiment of liberalism and secularism. And whether the differences concern politics, culture, or religion, the underlying opposition is always between modernity and backwardness, right? In that sense, Brubaker has called this as a civilizational threat. So the idea that we are liberated from religion, whereas the others are totally dominated by their religion, and then particularly Muslims. I think particularly interesting is the fact that Christianity nevertheless still plays a role, and even an important role, but not so much existing, practicing Christians in the Netherlands. And in the Netherlands, we, for instance, have a small, but nonetheless, a group of Orthodox Protestant people living in the Bible Belt in the Netherlands, which are still very much present, but they are not part of the Dutch self-image anymore. When in the Dutch self-image there is a place for Christianity, it is increasingly instrumentalized in nativist discourse. So Christianity not as a religion in terms of a confessional identity and practice, but as a general and vague heritage and cultural identity. In this self-image, which we call cultural Christianity, Christianity goes hand in hand with secularism and liberalism, right? So that might be historically quite surprising, but that is the idea that we have always been Christian, but also somewhat secular and also very liberal. So glossing over centuries of conflict, obviously, between religion and the state. But perhaps a funny example, but a very telling example, is how history becomes rewritten in this idea of the Dutch country. The leader of the Christian Democrats in 2017, his name is Buma, during the election campaign suggested that, and now I quote him, gender equality has been a Christian tradition for thousands of years. Well, that is quite something, right, to claim, given that in Christian tradition, the place of women have never been so equal. And obviously, more recently, right, I mean, there is quite some changes, but often opposed by, at least also in the Dutch case, by Christian parties, right? So, but in the rewriting of the history, now it is that we have always been modern, right? We have always been progressive. We have always been liberal. And the we then is also a kind of Judeo-Christian tradition that has always been characterized by that in opposition to Islam. Well, first thing to remember, so it is about religious nativism. So it's not about a religious dispute, right, between Christianity or secularism and Islamophobia, of Islam, sorry. It is a form of Islamophobia that's very specific because it claims that Muslims can never be Dutch, right? So it is not just Islamophobia, it's nativist Islamophobia. It implies that Muslims will never be perceived as Dutch citizens. And that obviously is quite something. So that's the first type of nativism I wanted to discuss, that we discuss in detail in our book. And the second is racial nativism. And I warn and I apologize that on the next slide there are black-faced people. But that is to show the racist caricature of the helper of Sinterklaas. I don't know whether you know this Dutch tradition, but till very recently, Sinterklaas was helped by black-faced people. And there was somewhat is, but there was a huge debate in which it became very clear that the Netherlands is very much colored by racial nativism, revolving around issues of racism between white Europeans and racial others. And then the nativist discourse on Black Pete, as the name of the black helper is a case in point, because anti-racist people criticize this blackface tradition of Black Pete, claiming that it was racist stereotyping, but then the anti-racists were attacked by the nativist. Not only were they blamed for creating division and hatred instead of national unity, but more particularly because their anti-racism then is racist towards white people, right? So it was the reverse of the argument. And the same arguments, as you all know probably, right, so that might happen in the UK as well, are used against Black Lives Matters movement, right, that they are divisive and that all kind of policies they favor, like affirmative action policies, is then a form of anti-white racism. Well, Trump clearly claims that as well. In other words, anti-black anti-racism then is interpreted both as an assault on Dutch culture, how dare these foreigners criticize our tradition, and also as a form of reverse racism. And as you probably are very much aware, because it is happening in the UK as well, a more radical version of racial nativism explicitly and often implicitly mobilizes replacement theories, revolving around the idea that intended or inintended white Europeans will become, in the near future, a minority in Europe in the demographic changes between whites and non-whites. Metropoles like London, Paris, and Berlin foreshadow this for the continent as a whole. That racism and racial nativism have simultaneously become more explicit and normalized in public discourse does not mean that the taboo on racism has totally disappeared. Even racists don't want to be called racist. And this is, I think, why nativists often use euphemisms like demographic changes instead of racial replacements. And Geert Wilders, for instance, so the leader of the biggest party, says, well, I'm not really a racist. I don't have something against Muslims necessarily. I'm just against Islam. Clearly, right? I mean, there is a slippery slope. But what is important to remember here again, it is not just racism. It's not just anti-black racism. Again, it's nativist, right? It's nativist because black citizens are not perceived as Dutch citizens. And therefore, people protesting against the tradition were immediately outcasted, were immediately pushed out of the nation. They were criticized as being un-Dutch because the very fact that they were blaming the Dutch for being racist showed that they were not Dutch themselves, right? So immediately, black activists were pushed out of the nation, and it is for quite some white people in the Netherlands unimaginable that Dutch citizens are not white. And that was very much became very clear in the debate regarding the Black Pete figure. So yes, for sure, anti-black racism, but nativist anti-black racism, right? So that is the second form of nativism. And that brings me to the third and final form, and that is populist nativism. Here is a picture of the leader of one of the other radical right parties, nativist parties, Thierry Baudet. His party was like 4 to 6 years ago the biggest, interestingly enough, but now he is rather small because he lost most of his seats to Wilders. But he was particularly somebody who was all the time attacking the elite, the liberal elite, right? Because he's elitist himself very much. But he was never attacked for being elitist because he showed as that he was truly Dutch. So what we do see, the third type of nativism is populist nativism. Here, the elite is attacked for being too cosmopolitan and alienated from national culture. They're also attacked for betraying Dutch people by celebrating and privileging immigrants, right? So then there is the suggestion of a connection. Attacking and betraying Dutch people by celebrating privileging immigrants and other minorities at the expense of the native population and its culture. And it is important to realize that the elite is challenged, and of course that is populist. Yet the reason this group is problematized, this elite, this liberal elite, is deeply nativist, right? It is allegedly cultural foreign outside of the nation. So the liberal elite is really not Dutch. And that is important to realize, right? So that also the liberal, white liberal elite then is perceived as foreign to the nation. And therefore we need a slightly different definition of nativism. It's not necessarily about foreigners in the sense that the liberal elite clearly is a Dutch citizen and perceived as Dutch citizen, but they are foreign to the Dutch nation, right? To the idea of what it is to be Dutch. They are betraying the Dutch nation. So due to its multicultural affinity and loyalty, the elite is depicted as a self-hating, self-destructive group of traitors who contribute to the nation's downfall, whether through passive neglect or active strategy. So that is not just an attack on the elite, not just populism, but again, nativist populism, right? So the third form of nativism, and then in the third variant, it is nativist populism. So that's important to realize that three forms of exclusion, three political cleavages, right? Racism, Islamophobia, populism, for sure they are all present, but they share one core. And the core is that the forms of anti-black racism, Islamophobia, and populism is that it's all nativist, right? So therefore, we wrote a book to show that this shared core of exclusionary forms of belonging these days in our countries. So they share that core, but that doesn't mean that the core is exactly the same, right? So let's be clear about that. So, for instance, this idea of black activists being foreign, Muslims being foreign to the Dutch state, the the white elite, liberal elite being foreign. That's all true. They all three are perceived as foreign, but the white liberal elite is less foreign, perceived as less foreign than Muslims and black Dutch citizens, right? So there are degrees, there are gradations, and the first gradation is in the degree of foreignness. But there are also gradations in what is perceived as threats. So, for instance, we have a huge debate about the position of the Dutch language, and the Dutch universities are slightly less welcoming to international students because almost half of our students were non-Dutch, and most of the teaching is in English. And rather suddenly, I would say, nowadays there is a debate about is this not replacement? Is it not that we are betraying the Dutch culture? Um, but that is about the level of language, right? Whereas um, sometimes it's really about the radical right telling Dutch citizens that Muslims, and particularly Moroccans, are a real threat. And Wilders became famous because he said, "What do you want?" He asked his own people, "What do you want? Do you want more or less Moroccans?" He really asked that. And then everybody was shouting, "Less Moroccans," right? So then that is a kind of threat that becomes very, very visceral, right? Very physical, almost physical. And that is important to realize because there are these gradations, but nativism in itself is a very radical ideology, right? Because it is really about who is native and who is not native. And if you are not native, then you cannot really belong to the soil, to the country. So what then is the solution? Well, the solution is then eventually that you have to leave, right? Or that you cannot exist there anymore in that form. Again, there are degrees of exclusion. I should not exaggerate. There are forms of exclusion where people say, well, for the moment, Dutch black citizens or Muslim citizens are not truly Dutch, but perhaps in the long run, they can become more Dutch, right? So then it, it is exclusion at this moment, but then there is still hope that they can become more native. Again, that is a degree, it is a gradation. But when we look into the discourse of radical right parties all over Europe, often it is very much about the most radical version, right? That in the end, there is no place for people who are not truly British or Dutch or French. And then quite some groups are excluded. So you might remember that in Germany there was this secret meeting in which people of the AfD and others came together, and they seriously discussed like how many people should be deported when AfD would come to power, right? So this is not something that we are inventing. When people embrace this idea of the true native and embrace the ideology, a nativist ideology, there is always the risk that there is this radical solution there, right? So that we should keep that in mind. At the same time, not exaggerate, because there are also more moderate versions, and I don't have the time to deal with that now too much today. But in the book, we do have a chapter on left-wing nativism, right? And we do show actually that left-wing parties in the Netherlands are almost forced to employ also a nativist discourse. And that might also be true for Labour, by the way, um, because of the dominance of the nativist frame. So then the left tried to counter the radical right by saying, well, actually, the discourse of the radical right is un-Dutch, right? So then they have to use the same argument, the same idea that people have to be Dutch in order to participate in the public debate or political debate. So they fell into that trap. But there is no way, perhaps, in politics to get out of there or to stay out of that trap because the nativist frame has become so dominant in a lot of our discussions. And it's not to say that the way left-wing parties are using nativist arguments or quasi-nativist arguments is the same and with the same intentions as the radical right. That's not the claim. But in the book, we do show that for left-wing parties, it's difficult not to use nativist arguments in order to counter the nativist attacks by the radical right. Perhaps two more remarks. First, about the irony of the past. So how's the past used in these nativist discourses? Nativism relies on idealized images of the past portraying the native population in terms of racial purity, cultural sameness, and communal harmony. That's everywhere the case, also in the Netherlands. And in the Netherlands, actually, that is quite striking because the Netherlands were never very culturally same. And as you might know, we have had a highly divided society, even famous for being a pillarized society, because the Roman Catholics and the Protestants and the non-religious people were in three different pillars and did not communicate, didn't go to the same schools, were not allowed to marry somebody from the other pillar. And I think the Netherlands actually came quite close to what happened in Northern Ireland, right? We barely escaped the fate of Northern Ireland and the fights between the Protestants and the Roman Catholics. But the very idea that our country or other countries were homogeneous and peaceful and harmonious in the past, and nowadays with the arrival of migrants, now suddenly we are not homogeneous anymore, is really again a drastic rewriting of the past. I mean, the Protestant and the Roman Catholics hated each other, and I somewhat experienced that, being rather old. But the stories of my parents and my grandparents, I mean, it was for them really unimaginable that they would marry somebody from the other pillar, right? For instance, so that already shows that this is an active rewriting of the past, and within the nativist discourse, there is an active rewriting of the past in various ways. In the Netherlands, there's a third radical right party, the Farmers Party. They also became quite big, and they rely on these idealized images of rustic rural life, not affected by the ills of multicultural metropolitan life. And there is a double irony at play here, a painful irony, I have to say. Former colonizing nations in Europe, such as the Netherlands, Britain, and France, experience people from former colonies and other non-European regions now as colonizers, threatening white native populations, right? That is the discourse of the radical right, that they now are colonizing, they are coming to us. And the second irony is then that the same nativists who see themselves part of this anti-colonial struggle against the invasion of multicultural ideas and people still defend and glorify and romanticize their own colonial past, right? Which is, of course, then totally incoherent, because why would we have been allowed to travel there and they don't have the right to travel here, right? But anyway, it is not in these discourses about logics or coherence. Quite surprising elements come together in one rather effective discourse. And that brings me to a last remark regarding liberalism. Um, the functioning of liberalism in nativist discourse is highly ambivalent. On the one hand, liberalism is seen as the defining essence of Western civilization, rendering it superior to allegedly backward, illiberal nations. At the same time, when liberalism is pushed too far, as multiculturalism or these days as wokeism, the nativist position regarding liberalism changes from a defining feature of superior identity to a threat to the nation's tradition and culture. Well, Orban, Hungary, right, is a clear example of this, and there he even embraced this idea of illiberal democracies, whereas radical right parties in Britain, in France, in the Netherlands, they are more ambivalent about this, I guess, and they still somewhat embrace liberalism or instrumentalize liberalism, but then as a defining cultural characteristics, but not to give space to other people and other cultures and political beliefs. For nativists, the end justifies the means. Because the natives need to defend themselves, it is justified to selectively use and dismiss liberal ideas. Perhaps some final remarks. As I said, the Netherlands is an improbable case, at least in the perspectives of many outside of the Netherlands. given that the Netherlands for a long time were perceived as being multicultural, as being liberal, and as being very tolerant, right? Well, I think we still are progressive in terms of values regarding euthanasia, abortion, gender, and sexuality. But I think one of the hard lessons of our days is that progressive people are not necessarily tolerant or not tolerant anymore regarding those who they think don't share in those liberal values, right? So what we do see actually is that liberal values are used to exclude others who are perceived as not sharing into those values. So I would argue that actually the Netherlands were never multicultural in the sense of multicultural policies. That is a big mistake to think that the Dutch pursued multicultural policies. That's not the case, not like in the UK, I think. Um, but yes, we are still progressive in that sense, right? That we still embrace liberal values. But that doesn't mean that we are tolerant, right? So the Dutch are in improbable case, but perhaps even in the Netherlands, we see this enormous rise of the radical right, using progressive values to exclude others. And we did include in the book France and the US, because those two countries are also perceived as improbable cases for the rise and the return of nativism. I don't can go for time reasons now into details, but you might know the literature where there is always a very strong claim that countries that have as birthright, right? So that have as access to citizenship, I should say, access to citizenship based on birthright. So in France and in the US, one gets nationality when born in the country, right? So jus soli. Whereas in other countries like Germany, jus sanguinis. So that means that it is far more difficult for migrants and their children to get nationality. That's a bit sketchy, and we all remember that there's the book by Brubaker in which he claims, right, that in countries like the US and France, racism and also nativism would be less probable, given the different traditions in which jus soli is far more inclusive for migrants and their children compared to Germany. Well, I think we have to conclude that that is nonsensical, right? I mean, France obviously has a very strong radical right party, and the party of Le Pen is extremely nativist and also anti-racist, racist, nativist racist, nativist Islamophobic, clearly as well, right? So it's, I think, an empirical but important question like, does birthright matter? Does access to citizenship regimes matter? And they do matter, but not in the way as Brubaker has been suggesting. We can discuss the German case. More recently, clearly, there's also a rise of the radical right there. So it's not to say that that's not the case, but the argument was that in France and in the US, it would be improbable given jus soli, but also, particularly in the US case, given the fact that it is a country of immigrants. And the country of immigrants, then the idea was that there is no place for nativism because nobody can claim being native except for the First Nation, except for indigenous people. When I made this slide, Trump was still somewhat fading away, but well, we all know that he is back and with a very strong nativist program, right? So again, I think we should be very much aware as social scientists not to have these huge claims that in countries that are immigration countries or that have jus soli, nativism would not be on the rise again. It has returned in many countries, also in many immigrant countries, not only in the US, but also, for instance, in Australia, right? So there are many more countries where the radical right, the nativist radical right is on the rise. I could go more into detail and explain to what extent, and in the US, anti-Black nativism, American anti-Muslim sentiments are nativist or populism is nativist. I will do that for time reasons. I prefer to hear your questions and to try to answer those. Obviously, last remark, Trump's populism was very clearly very, very nativist, and the left-wing elite, or Washington as in general, is disqualified as being un-American all the time, right? So I think that illustrates that nativism, and if I may say so in a normative way, sadly enough, it has become the dominant political frame of our times. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Duyvendak, for this insightful talk with loads of interesting insights. So I'm sure there's a lot to discuss. So if there are any questions, please raise your hand, and then hopefully we can answer the questions. Yes, Marco, go ahead.
Yes, I can start. Thank you very much, Jan Willem. I'm not sure it's a proper question. It's more maybe a reflection on what you have presented. So let me rewind. So nativism, the way you define, and I agree with that. Maybe I emphasize even further the geographical dimension, right? For me, nativism is very much something to do with geography. The things that you said before, who is here but is actually not from here. And every time someone say, where are you from? You're not from here, go home. And then you do obviously have what you, in your previous book, very much explore the politics of home, which is again its geographical dimension. But if we have to reflect even further in terms of what does define that in-place belonging, I do see that the notion of race is paramount. So it's very much, how do we define who is from here, who is not from here? It's all down to race. I would like to hear whether you actually share this view or not. But then I have a second maybe point, because if you think about the way the nation is constructed, who is from here, who is not from here, and all these go home, it's very much, has always been nativist. So why do we need to use the return? Nativism might be subside during certain time, but is structurally embedded in the way we define the nation, in the way we define home, in the way we define homeland. I'm not sure whether you also share these points or not. So there's a point of race, there's a point of the structural connotation of the nation in terms of, again, a nativist, possibly home. And then the return, possibly, I might agree with you that the return is that maybe now it takes more of a populist connotation that maybe in the past didn't have it. But yeah, so just some reflections there for you to comment on more than a specific question. Yeah, thank you, Jan Willem. Thank you.
Thanks so much for these observations and questions. And obviously, right, it is very much about geography. It's very much about soil. It is about the claim to one's homeland and the difficulty to share a homeland. And in that sense, I didn't discuss Israel-Gaza for the moment, but right, the claim to the same soil by different groups and how difficult it is, well, to share. And indeed, the book is about the radical right mostly in Western countries. But it is important what you say that with the birth of the nation state, right, there is this idea of a people and a culture and a territory, right, a geography. And that has had a lot of consequences. Sometimes also, if I may say so, perhaps progressive consequences. I very briefly hinted at the anti-colonial struggle, and the anti-colonial struggle was very effective, right? Because the people who were already there before the colonizers came claimed that land as theirs, and the colonizers then suddenly were just like, oh, we are not from here. so the very fact there are moments, I would say, of positive nativism, perhaps. Perhaps the next book, I will perhaps work on a book on questions of indigeneity and nativism, right? Because for the indigenous people, obviously, it's the same, that they have, the only thing that they can claim is their land, right? So it is all about geography, and then geography in relation to, in relation to power differences. Race, it's a lot about race. It's a lot about whiteness. It's a lot about the replacement ID. Even though I have to say, and I'm not sure whether that's the same in the UK, that one could argue that Islam is racialized, and it is actually not so much about Islam. It is really about those who are not really white British or white Dutch people. We do see some differences between the nativism against Dutch black citizens and Dutch Muslim citizens. And when we started the project, I was actually still convinced that the nativist anti-Islamophobia was by far the strongest. Stronger, interestingly enough, than the nativism against Dutch black citizens. But I'm not so sure anymore. So there, the recent years, I was really shocked to learn and to see that even though we thought that the differences and between white citizens and people from the former colonies, like from Suriname, had become much smaller in terms of intermarriage and all these kind of things, right? And the anti-black racism was still much more there than I expected and anticipated, and then we were aware. But there's not. I'm not happy to say, therefore, it's just all race, right? I will still make the distinction between these anti-Islam nativist sentiments and the anti-black, because that is not based on religion at all. These are the general notions of culture. A final remark regarding your last observation about, is it really a return? No, you're right? It's always there, given the fact that we are living in nation states, right? So we learn that we are Dutch or British or whatever we are in English. But we meant return, somewhat rhetorical, but we meant it that it has become so dominant. So in the Netherlands, when I was like in my 20s, we discussed many things, but never we asked the question whether or not something was Dutch. That was just not a category we were thinking about. And nowadays, all discussions are all the time whether something is Dutch or not, right? So that is an enormous change, I have to say, in the way politics deals with topics. And if something cannot be labeled as being typically Dutch, then you're out. And it paralyzes very much, because then it's all one-dimensional, right? Whether it's Dutch or non-Dutch. And obviously that discussion never ends, because we disagree about what is truly Dutch. Like you will disagree about what's truly British, probably. So it is an endless debate, but the thing is, it's the only perspective in which topics are discussed. And that is really different from, let's say, 25, 30 years ago.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think there's another question from Erik Storm. Please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. It's me now, eh? Yeah. Okay. Well, very interesting to meet you first online, although we live in the same country. But I would like to follow up a bit on Marco's question, that so the return of nativism. So what then do you think are the main causes that provoke this change? And then maybe also, what do you see as kind of solutions to combat this frame of belonging and nativism versus here and foreigners? So I also see it among my students that they use words like folk and people and the Dutch and non-Dutch and English and non-English very easily. So how can we change the narrative in a way?
Yeah, thanks for those two questions. Related, obviously, right? Because if you know about the causes, you can perhaps do something about it. There is a chapter in the book where we discuss popular explanations of causes, and we mostly, I hope at least, we show actually that those explanations often don't hold. So there are quite some claims out there why there is this broader, the rise of the radical right, or more precisely, the rise of nativism, the return of nativism. And most are just not very convincing. But the problem is we don't have the answer either, right? So what we can show is that people, Marxists, will say, oh, but it is because of increasing inequalities, or it is the financial crisis, and so on. Well, you can give many counterexamples there. And for instance, the Netherlands, actually, we barely have any increase in inequalities, and we have a huge increase in the radical right. So there are many counterexamples, and it is important to realize that, right? Because the claims of our colleagues are quite strong, right? Some people will say, of course, it's related to migration. But that, again, is far too easy to say, because we know of countries that have been receiving hundreds of thousands of immigrants and asylum seekers without a lot of problems, and other countries who have barely any asylum seekers have enormous anti-immigrant sentiments, right? And yeah, of course, we have a lot of sad examples out there that anti-Semitism is very strong there where there are barely any Jews left, right? So it is really not about hard numbers. It is not about the number of people coming. Obviously, migration and globalization, however you want to define that, are necessary conditions in order to have this idea that so many people are coming here, but absolute numbers don't explain much, I have to say. So it is very important to look into the explanations. And what I found mostly convincing actually is that the success of the radical right is the success of the radical right politicians. So what we do see is that they very effectively frame topics and almost all topics, housing, welfare state policies, all topics in terms of those who deserve, natives, and those who don't deserve, right? And that is not a good answer to your question necessarily, because it's partly an answer in the sense that progressive politicians should do a far better job and should stay out of the nativist frame, because then they will always lose, because then they reproduce this idea that there are two categories, the natives and the non-natives, deserving and non-deserving. But as I said, that is very difficult for the left. It's not a full explanation, but I don't think that we should look for objective factors out there that explain the recent rise or return of the native, of the right, of the radical right, but very much look into the efficacy, the effectiveness of the rhetoric of the radical right itself.
Thank you for that. I think there's one extra question from Thomas. So Thomas, please go ahead.
Hi, Jan. Thanks for the talk. Really, really interesting. Thank you. You touched upon it very briefly. I'm wondering whether you can just elaborate on how rural areas are impacted by nativism as a polarity to the multicultural cosmopolitan, I think, in which it's sort of analyzed and sort of so often discussed.
Yeah, thanks for that question. And I think the rural urban is really interesting, because we did see, well, Vance himself, right? I mean, so in the US case, it is very clear, like the mobilization of the people from the Midwest there, but also in the Netherlands with the farmers' parties in many more countries. It is really this, there are barely any farmers left. But still, I mean, this idea, this archetypical idea of the farmer who is really, right, has the claim to the soil. So there is something about the rural areas that makes them more native in a certain way. And I don't know what is the case in the UK, but in the Netherlands, for instance, also, I think we almost all agree that people belong more to the soil than in the city. I will give an example. So in the Netherlands, in small villages, it's almost forbidden to construct new houses, but if new houses are built, they are reserved for the children of the people who already live there. We don't ask the people in the villages to accept people from elsewhere, whereas in the big cities, in all kind of neighborhoods, also disadvantaged neighborhoods, we do expect that people don't say, oh, it's our neighborhood, but that they are open to others to arrive there, because I think deep down we perceive their link to the soil, to the city in a different way, right? And we do see that the radical right mobilizes that very, very effectively, that people living in the big cities are either cosmopolitan or are free floating, are not really part of this nation, right? So I think as I try to elaborate in my book on the politics of home, this idea that some soil is more homely than other, right? The geography is very much there. And more recently, we see how that is used and mobilized. And again, right? I don't want to say, I don't understand this just as a normative judgment. I try to be analytical there, because obviously people in disadvantaged geographical areas far from London or far from Amsterdam can mobilize on that basis as well, right? So this is our soil and we are not treated in the same way. So it can also be, again, I don't know whether I like the term positive nativism, but there is something there that people can mobilize who are in unequal circumstances.
Really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Any more questions? If not, I might have another question. I was very interested in what you said about the left-wing nativism, because obviously when we look at right-wing discourse, it's very obvious that there's a nativist element in there. But when we look at left-wing nativism, can we say that that's purely reactive to the right-wing discourse, or is there also something that's quite unique maybe to left-wing nativist discourse?
Yeah, so in the book, so perhaps other people can better answer that question, because in the book, what we do see in the Dutch case, that I should be more precise, there you're totally right. It's mostly reactive, even though we do have a socialist party in the Netherlands, and they have the tendency sometimes to mobilize nativist sentiments themselves in the political debate, because for them it's a way to avoid other forms of division among people. So then they say the Dutch or the Dutch workers mostly, right? So then they mobilize it in a way to avoid other cleavages. But then also quite often in the end, they support anti-migrant policies. So there you see that how risky it is even for left-wing parties, or also for left-wing parties, to start that kind of discourse. And in the last week, I don't know whether that was also in the international news, but Dutch Parliament by far majority voted for a motion that said that we should control for the religious beliefs and study the religious belief of our migrants and their children, and not for everybody, right? Just for those groups. And then we see that indeed people who think in this divide between natives and non-natives, the migrants, yeah, it's not naively, right? They cannot escape thinking in those terms, as if we don't have equal treatment of everybody, as if this is not discriminatory, right? So for the left, it is not just reactive. It's for some left-wing parties, yeah, we do see that it becomes part of their rhetoric. Next to that, there is support, as I just said, for groups that have been left behind, and that can be in areas of the country where people are left behind, and then they are also supported because they are Groningers or Frisians or whatever, right? So there you do see that there is this link to the soil, and there perhaps one could argue that that is a form of positive nativism, even though in the long run there it is also risky and exclusionary, I would think, right? So because then the Frisians, the people in the north of the Netherlands, truly belong there, and other people do not belong there then, right? Or something like that. So I think that, well, yeah, perhaps this is too broad an answer, but if you think about positive nativism and if you think about the anti-colonial struggle in which it clearly was a tool to push out the colonizers, after decolonization, it was extremely difficult for the new nations to deal with internal pluriformity, right? Because it was this idea that they were one group pushing out the colonizers and that they were the true natives. But then this question started because they were thinking in nativist terms, but who is really the true native of India? Who's really the true native of Cameroon, right? And then you have all these infights between groups claiming to be the true native. So there might be a progressive moment in an in a nativist struggle, but there's always the risk of that in the end, it will be an infighting between groups that claim to be even more native, right? So there is this devilish spiral going on there.
Thank you. That's great. Any other questions? I think it's a good reason to start reading the book.
That would be nice.
Yeah.
I can still show it, but it was also on the first page of the thing. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. All right. I think there's no other questions. Marco, is there anything that you would like to say?
I'll say thank you very much, Jan Willem. Yeah, it's great. Yeah, thank you again.
Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for the invitation.
No worries. So yeah, I think it's time to wrap it up. So thank you very much, Professor Duyvendak, for joining us today. So as I said, the presentation will be recorded and will be put on the website of the LUNN. So if you'd like to rewatch the seminar, then that's possible. So thank you very much again, and we hope to see you at the next seminar.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye.